plane was preparing for takeoff, passengers settling into their seats, the usual quiet hum of a flight about to begin. But in first class, tension crackled in the air. A flight attendant stood rigid, her voice sharp with authority. "You need to move. This seat isn't for you." The young boy blinked, clutching his first-class ticket tightly, confusion flashing in his wide eyes. "But this is my seat." The flight attendant scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't think so." Nearby passengers turned to watch, some whispering under their breath, others pretending not to see. No one spoke up, no one questioned it. But what the flight attendant didn't know, the boy's father owned the airline. And by the time this flight lands, she'll wish she had never opened her mouth. Before we start the story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Jaden Coleman stepped onto the plane with a quiet sense of excitement, gripping the straps of his backpack as he moved through the luxurious first-class cabin. The scent of fresh leather and faint cologne filled the air, the overhead lights casting a soft glow over the pristine white seats. He had been on planes before, of course. His father traveled constantly, and sometimes he got to tag along. But this was different. This time, he was flying alone. It was a reward for his hard work, a promise his father had made after he aced his final exams. "You earned this, son," Jordan Coleman had said, pressing the first-class ticket into his hand with a proud smile. Jaden carried that ticket like it was gold, proof of everything he had worked for. He found his seat, 3A, a window seat, just like he had asked, and slid into it, feeling the soft leather against his back. He let out a slow breath, glancing around the cabin. The other passengers, mostly business people dressed in tailored suits, were settling in, barely sparing him a glance. Flight attendants moved smoothly between them, offering champagne and warm towels, their voices polite but distant. For a moment, Jaden allowed himself to relax. Then came the voice. "Excuse me, young man." He looked up, blinking. The flight attendant standing over him was a tall woman with sharp features and perfectly styled blonde hair. Her uniform was pristine, her name tag gleaming under the cabin lights. Emily Carter. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Jaden's attention. It was her tone. It was the kind of voice adults used when they already believed they were right, the kind that made kids feel like they had done something wrong before they even knew what was happening. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, her arms crossed. Her voice was firm but with a sharp edge, loud enough that a few passengers nearby looked up from their phones. Jaden frowned, straightening in his seat. "Yes, ma'am," he said politely, already reaching into his hoodie pocket for his ticket. He pulled it out and handed it to her. "Seat 3A." Emily took the ticket but barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "This is a first-class seat," she said slowly, as if explaining something to a child who didn't understand. "I know," Jaden said, confused. "That's what my ticket says." She gave him a tight-lipped smile, but it wasn't the friendly kind. It was the kind adults gave when they were about to tell you something you wouldn't like. "Where are your parents?" Jaden's stomach tightened. He had expected some people to be surprised that he was flying alone, but the way she asked the question, the way she looked at him, made his skin prickle. He lifted his chin. "I'm traveling alone." Emily's expression didn't change, but her posture did. She straightened her shoulders, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the ticket. "I see," she said, her voice shifting into something clipped and professional. "There must have been a mistake. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only." Jaden's heart started to pound. He sat up straighter, gripping the armrests. "I am a first-class passenger." Emily sighed like she was dealing with a difficult customer. "I think there's been some confusion," she said, her voice gentler now, like she was trying to be patient. "You need to take your things and move to economy." A hush settled over the nearby rows. The businessman in the seat next to him shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be focused on his newspaper. A woman 2 seats ahead adjusted her sunglasses, sneaking a glance but saying nothing. No one spoke up. No one questioned it. Jaden hesitated, heat creeping up his neck. He looked down at his ticket again, as if checking it would change anything. "But this is my seat," he said, his voice quieter now. Emily sighed again, this time less patient. "Sir, I'm asking you nicely. You need to move." His throat felt tight. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't being loud. He wasn't even arguing. He just wanted to sit in the seat he had been given. But now, every second that passed made it harder to fight back. Passengers were watching. His ears burned with embarrassment. He could feel the judgment, the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached down, grabbed his backpack, and stood. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped into the aisle. Emily didn't offer to help. She simply turned, motioning toward the back of the plane. "Right this way." He walked past the rows of first-class seats, past the passengers who had watched everything but said nothing. His eyes stayed forward, his chest tight. He wouldn't let them see his face. He wouldn't let them see how much this moment stung. When he reached economy, he lowered himself into an empty seat, gripping the armrest. The seat was smaller, the space was tighter. The air felt different. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then, without thinking, he reached for his phone and typed a quick message. "They made me move to the back. Said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me." He stared at the message for a second before pressing send. The phone vibrated almost instantly with a response. "What do you mean they made you move?" "Who made you move?" His father's words were short, sharp, not panicked, focused. Jaden hesitated before replying. "The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen." This time the response took longer. The dots blinked on the screen for a full 5 seconds before a new message appeared. "What's the flight number?" Jaden's fingers trembled slightly as he checked the boarding pass and typed it out. He hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. The reply came almost instantly. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." He exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't know exactly what his father meant, but something in those words told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Emily Carter stood tall as she led Jaden Coleman down the narrow aisle toward the economy section, her steps confident, her face expressionless. To her, this was routine. Just another moment where she had to correct a seating mistake before takeoff. Yet, deep inside, there was something else. A quiet, lingering satisfaction. She had seen it before, passengers trying to sit where they didn't belong, assuming they could slip past unnoticed, but not on her watch. She prided herself on maintaining order, ensuring first class remained exactly as it should be. Exclusive, prestigious, and reserved for those who deserve to be there. And in her mind, this boy didn't fit that image. Jaden walked with his head down, his grip tightening on the straps of his backpack. The weight of countless eyes pressed against his back, though none of them dared to meet his. He didn't need to look up to know what they were thinking. He could feel it, the judgment, the silent agreement, the quiet, unspoken belief that he didn't belong. No one had defended him. No one had asked Emily to check the system. They had simply watched as she decided without proof, without question, that he wasn't supposed to be there. As they passed the last row of first-class seats, Jaden caught a glimpse of a businessman adjusting his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. A woman in a pearl necklace glanced at him, then quickly turned away, pretending to scroll through her phone. Another man, a younger one, sighed and shook his head slightly, but still said nothing. That was the part that stung the most. Not just Emily's actions, but the silence of the people around him. He wondered if things would have been different if he had been older, if he had been dressed in a suit like the others, or if he had been white. Right here. Emily gestured toward an empty economy seat near the back, her voice clipped, impatient. Jaden hesitated, glancing at the seat, then back at her. She raised an eyebrow, her tone sharpening. Is there a problem? He wanted to say something, to ask why she hadn't even checked before making him move, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, his chest constricted. He had never been the type to cause trouble, had never been in a situation where an adult looked at him and just decided he was in the wrong. He had always been taught to be polite, to respect authority, to comply. But right now, compliance felt like defeat. Slowly, he lowered himself into the seat. His knees bumped against the seat in front of him, no legroom. The armrests felt harder, the atmosphere stuffier, suffocating. Next, the space between the seats was so much smaller back here, crammed with passengers already settling in, readjusting their belongings. It felt different. It felt less. Emily gave a small nod as if satisfied and turned on her heel, heading back to first class without another glance. It was done. Problem solved. Jaden stared out the window, his fingers gripping his backpack, his pulse pounding in his ears. His father's words echoed in his mind. You earned this, son. But it didn't feel like that anymore. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, his stomach twisting, his thoughts spiraling. Then, almost without thinking, his hand moved. He unzipped the front pocket of his hoodie, pulled out his phone, and typed. They made me move to the back. I said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came almost immediately. What do you mean they made you move? Who made you move? His father's words were sharp, focused, not panicked, but dangerous. Jaden hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. He knew his father well enough to recognize that tone. It was the one he used when someone had made a mistake they were going to regret. The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen. This time the response took longer. The three dots blinked for a full 5 seconds before a new message appeared. What's the flight number? Jaden checked his boarding pass, typed it out, and hit send. Another message arrived within seconds. Stay where you are. I'll handle it. Jaden let out a slow breath, but it did little to ease the weight pressing against his chest. He didn't know what his father was about to do, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Emily Carter moved swiftly through the aisles, handing out menus and preparing for takeoff as if nothing had happened. She felt good. She had done her job, maintained order, and ensured that first class remained exclusive to its intended clientele. At the galley, a younger flight attendant, Nicole Jennings, set down a tray of glasses and hesitated. She had seen what happened. She had heard every word, and something about it didn't sit right with her. Was there a problem with his ticket? Nicole asked carefully, her voice low. Emily scoffed, adjusting her uniform. Please, you saw him. Do you really think he paid for first class? Nicole's stomach twisted. She had worked plenty of flights. She had seen people of all backgrounds in first class, wealthy families, young entrepreneurs, celebrities in sweatpants. But the way Emily said it, it made her uneasy. But you didn't even check the system, Nicole said, her voice firmer this time. Emily waved a dismissive hand. Trust me, I've been doing this a long time. I know when someone's in the wrong section, the sooner they learn, the better. Nicole bit her tongue. The words didn't sit right. But what was she supposed to do? Challenge someone with more experience? Risk making a scene? She turned back to stacking trays, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. Then the intercom crackled. Emily Carter, please report to the cockpit immediately. Emily's hand froze mid-reach. She glanced toward the front of the plane, her confident expression faltering for just a second. That wasn't normal. Flight attendants didn't get called to the cockpit unless something was wrong. The other attendants exchanged looks. Nicole watched as Emily stiffened, smoothing her uniform before making her way toward the front of the plane. As she passed through first class, a few passengers looked up from their screens, sensing the shift in energy. Something was happening. Something big. The moment Emily stepped inside the cockpit, the atmosphere changed. The captain, a seasoned pilot with graying hair, turned to face her. He wasn't alone. On the small screen of the in-flight phone, a live video feed showed a man sitting in a high-rise office, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was unreadable. His presence alone sent a chill down Emily's spine. The captain spoke first, his voice firm. "Emily, do you know who this is?" Emily swallowed. "No, sir." The man on the screen leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but deadly. "My name is Jordan Coleman. I own this airline." Emily's stomach dropped. The captain's voice was like a blade. "And you just removed his son from first class." A cold, suffocating silence filled the cockpit. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She had made a mistake. A very, very big mistake. Emily Carter stood frozen in the cockpit, her breath suddenly shallow, her confidence unraveling at a terrifying pace. The name Jordan Coleman echoed in her mind, but the weight of it didn't truly settle until she saw the way the captain was looking at her. Sharp, unblinking, as if he already knew that whatever happened next would not end in her favor. The man on the screen, Jordan Coleman, barely moved, yet his presence suffocated the small space. His posture was relaxed, but there was something unnerving about it. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't shouting. He wasn't even angry, at least not in a way that could be easily seen. Instead, he was watching her with a level of calm control that was infinitely more dangerous. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as she forced out the only words she could manage. I didn't realize. Jordan tilted his head slightly, his fingers interlocked as he leaned just an inch closer to the screen. "Didn't realize what exactly?" His voice was smooth, unreadable, but there was something beneath it, a blade concealed in velvet. Emily hesitated, feeling the weight of the captain's eyes on her, the quiet anticipation from the co-pilot. They were waiting for her to say something, waiting for her to somehow justify what she had done. But there was no justification. She scrambled for control, straightening her shoulders, though she could feel her uniform sticking uncomfortably to the back of her neck. "I thought there was a mistake with his seat," she said carefully, trying to sound professional, trying to sound like she hadn't just made what was probably the biggest mistake of her career. Jordan let a beat of silence stretch between them before he spoke again. "Did you check the manifest?" Emily blinked, her stomach twisting. His eyes narrowed. "Did you check the system before deciding my son didn't belong?" Emily's pulse pounded against her ribs. She could feel her composure slipping, feel her usual air of authority crumbling under the weight of the truth. She hadn't checked. She had looked at a young black boy sitting alone in first class and had simply assumed. Jordan exhaled softly, shaking his head. "You know what the worst part is?" he mused, his voice deceptively smooth. "It's that I'm not surprised." Emily's stomach dropped. "I've seen it happen before," he continued, his tone casual in a way that made it infinitely more damning. "I've seen people like you decide in an instant that someone doesn't belong. You didn't verify his name. You didn't check his ticket. You just saw him sitting in a seat you thought was out of reach, and instead of asking questions, you made a decision." His voice hardened just slightly, just enough to make the hairs on the back of Emily's neck rise. "A wrong decision!" Emily wanted to protest, wanted to say she wasn't that kind of person, that it wasn't about race, that it was just a misunderstanding. But every word that tried to rise in her throat withered before they could reach her lips. Because what could she say? The facts were against her. The passengers had seen it. The flight attendants had seen it. Jordan Coleman had seen it. The captain shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "Mr. Coleman, how would you like us to proceed?" Jordan's eyes didn't leave Emily's. "You're going to have her walk back there," he said, his voice like steel, "and personally escort my son back to first class. You're going to have her apologize in front of every single passenger who watched her throw him out. And when this plane lands, she is going to explain herself to the executive board." Emily's breath caught in her throat. That executive board! A cold sweat broke out at the base of her neck. Is that understood? Jordan asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. The captain nodded without hesitation. Yes, sir. Jordan's gaze remained locked onto Emily's. And you, he said, his voice dropping just slightly, making every word cut deeper. You are going to take your time making sure my son understands exactly why you thought he didn't belong in that seat. Emily felt her chest constrict. The screen went dark. For a long moment, no one moved. The cockpit felt suffocating, too small, too quiet, too final. Emily could hear her own pulse in her ears, hear the subtle shift of the co-pilot beside her, hear the controlled inhale of the captain as he finally turned toward her. Well, he said, his voice grim, you heard him. Emily's hands were clammy as she turned on autopilot, her feet moving before she could fully register what was happening. She had no choice. As she stepped out of the cockpit, the air in the cabin felt different. First-class passengers, previously relaxed, were now aware that something was wrong. Some glanced up, sensing the tension, while others kept their heads down, pretending they weren't suddenly invested in the unfolding drama. She reached the thin curtain separating first class from economy and hesitated, her fingers hovering over the fabric for just a second before she pulled it aside and stepped through. Immediately, she spotted him. Jaden was sitting by the window, his small backpack tucked beneath his seat, his hands folded in his lap. His face was calm, unreadable. He wasn't crying. He wasn't making a scene. He was just waiting. Passengers in the surrounding rows glanced up, curiosity flickering in their eyes. They had seen what had happened earlier. Now they were watching again, waiting to see what she would do. Emily's throat was dry as she forced herself to crouch slightly, leveling herself with his eyeline. Sir, she said, her voice lower than before. There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class. Jaden blinked, tilting his head slightly. A misunderstanding? Emily nodded quickly, desperately, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Yes, there was an error in seating. His eyes stayed locked onto hers, steady and sharp. But I had my ticket, he said, his voice even. You saw it, and you still told me to move. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. They had heard everything earlier. They knew he was right. Emily swallowed hard. I may have misjudged the situation, she said carefully, trying to frame it in a way that didn't sound as bad as it was. But I'd like to correct it now. Please come with me. Jaden didn't move right away. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just watched her. His silence stretched longer than she was comfortable with. Then, slowly, he reached for his phone. Emily stiffened as she felt her work tablet vibrate. She pulled it from her pocket, fingers shaking slightly as she read the forwarded message from the airline's executive office. Take your time. Make her understand what she did. Her heart pounded. Jaden looked at her again, his voice quiet but impossibly steady. I'll go back, he said. But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong here. A murmur spread through the nearby passengers. Some sat up straighter. Others turned to whisper. Emily felt heat flood her face. For the first time in her career, she was being held accountable, and she had never felt smaller. The lesson from this story is the power of accountability and the impact of unconscious bias. Emily Carter believed she was simply enforcing the rules, but in reality, she was acting on an assumption, one that led to the public humiliation of an innocent child. Her authority blinded her to the truth. She had never questioned why she made certain decisions, only that she had the power to make them. But power without responsibility is dangerous. The moment she was forced to answer for her actions, she realized that assumptions, especially those rooted in bias, can have real consequences. This story highlights the importance of treating every person with the same level of respect and dignity, regardless of appearance. It also serves as a reminder that silence is complicity. The passengers who watched and said nothing were just as much a part of the problem. Ultimately, Emily's downfall wasn't just about a mistake, it was about a mindset that had gone unchallenged for too long. True change only happens when people are willing to reflect, learn, and take responsibility. Not because they were caught, but because they understand why it matters. Jaden Coleman sat in silence, his face unreadable as he waited for Emily to answer his question. Around him, the tension in the air had thickened, the murmurs of nearby passengers growing louder. Some were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others subtly stealing glances in his direction, realizing too late that they had been witnesses to something they should have spoken up about. The first-class cabin, once an oasis of quiet luxury, now felt like the epicenter of a slow-moving disaster, one where everyone was beginning to understand that things were about to change. Emily Carter, usually poised, felt the weight of every single stare pressing against her back. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, her breath short, her heart hammering. She could still feel the sting of Jordan Coleman's words in her head, his voice calm yet devastating. Take your time. Make her understand what she did. What was she supposed to say? There was no excuse, no justification, no way to talk herself out of this one. She had made a split-second decision, had acted without verifying anything, and now the entire plane was watching as a child was holding her accountable. Jaden tilted his head slightly, his dark brown eyes sharp and unwavering. Well, he pressed, his voice neither loud nor demanding, but firm enough that it made her stomach twist. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no script for this, no protocol for how to explain a mistake like this. And for the first time in her career, she realized she had no control. I misjudged, she finally forced out, her voice quieter than before. I should have checked first. Jaden's lips pressed together in a thin line. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for him. Slowly, he reached for his backpack and stood up. He wasn't smug. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His composure, his quiet dignity made it clear that this wasn't about getting revenge. It was about something much bigger than that. Emily turned stiffly, leading the way back to first class, her posture rigid as they moved through the economy section. This walk felt different. When she had led him out earlier, she had felt justified, convinced she had been enforcing the rules. Now, as she escorted him back, she felt exposed. The whispers of passengers followed her like a shadow, a quiet reminder of her failure. When they re-entered first class, some passengers avoided looking at them, their guilt written all over their faces. Others watched openly, curious, as if trying to gauge how bad this was going to get. Jaden slid into his original seat, 3A, the very seat he had been forced to give up. Not with triumph, but with the calm confidence of someone who had never needed permission to be there in the first place. Emily inhaled shakily, adjusting her uniform. "If there's anything you need," she mumbled, her voice faltering. Jaden didn't look up from his phone. "You didn't ask me that before," he said simply, flipping open the in-flight magazine. Emily stiffened. The weight of that single sentence hit harder than she had expected. Before she could say anything else, a voice over the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, cabin crew. Emily Carter, please report to the cockpit immediately." Emily's stomach dropped. Passengers exchanged looks. A few flight attendants glanced at one another. That wasn't normal. Nicole, the younger flight attendant, was standing near the galley, arms crossed. She didn't smirk this time, didn't say, "I told you so." She simply watched as Emily turned pale. Emily forced herself to move, her steps unnaturally stiff as she made her way back toward the front of the plane. Her thoughts raced. What else could they possibly say to her? Hadn't she already been humiliated enough? Hadn't Jordan Coleman already made it clear that her career was on the line? The moment she stepped into the cockpit, the door closing behind her, she felt a shift in the air. The captain, who had been silent earlier, now regarded her with thinly veiled disappointment, The co-pilot barely looked at her, but it was the second screen that made Emily's breath catch. Another video call. But this time, it wasn't just Jordan Coleman. It was the entire executive board of the airline. 7 people, all in crisp suits, all watching her, all aware of what she had done. Emily's mouth went dry. The lead executive, a sharp-eyed woman with short silver hair, leaned forward slightly. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice cool, professional, "it has come to our attention that you forcibly removed a passenger from first class without checking their ticket. Is this correct?" Emily felt every ounce of air leave her lungs. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was an interrogation. Her tongue felt heavy in her mouth, but she forced herself to respond. Yes." Jordan Coleman, whose face remained unreadable, tilted his head slightly. "So you're admitting that you made a decision based on assumption rather than fact?" Emily wanted to shrink. She wanted to disappear. But there was no way out of this. She nodded stiffly. "Yes." Silence. Then the silver-haired executive exhaled slowly. "Miss Carter, you are hereby suspended without pay pending a formal review of your conduct, effective immediately." Emily's stomach lurched. "Well, wait!" Jordan's voice cut through her like ice. "No discussions, Miss Carter." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You wanted to be the authority on that plane, didn't you?" She flinched. "That's the thing about authority," he continued. "It comes with responsibility. And today, you proved that you weren't responsible enough to have it." Emily couldn't breathe. Another executive spoke. "Upon landing, you will remain on board for further instructions. Do not attempt to leave the aircraft without an escort." She felt lightheaded. The words "did not attempt to leave the aircraft" rang in her head, making her realize just how serious this was. She had seen it happen before. Flight attendants who had made career-ending mistakes, who had been walked straight off the plane, stripped of their authority in a matter of minutes. This was really happening. She had lost control. Jordan's voice was the last thing she heard before the screen went black. "Actions have consequences, Miss Carter." And then he was gone. Emily stood there motionless, her entire body cold. For years, she had been the one in charge, the one who enforced the rules, the one who decided who belonged where. And now she was powerless. The weight of what she had done settled over her like a crushing force. She turned and walked out of the cockpit, but this time, it felt like a walk toward the end of everything she had worked for. Emily Carter walked out of the cockpit, feeling like the walls of the plane were closing in on her. The hum of the engines, the quiet murmurs of passengers, the clinking of glasses in first class. It was all still there, but it felt different now. The sound wasn't comforting. It wasn't familiar. It was suffocating. She had always walked these aisles with authority. At every step she took on a flight, I had always been confident, assured. She was the one enforcing the rules, setting the tone, making sure everything went exactly as it should. But now she felt like she was being watched. And she was. As she made her way back into the main cabin, she could feel the subtle shift in energy. First-class passengers who had barely given her a second glance before were now watching. Some tried to be discreet, peering over their menus, while others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. They had seen the way she had dragged the boy to economy. And now they saw her bringing him back. Nicole, the younger flight attendant, was near the galley, her expression unreadable. She said nothing as Emily passed, but there was something in her eyes. Something that made Emily's stomach twist even harder. Pity. Emily forced herself to straighten her shoulders, to keep her face neutral, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had spent 15 years in this job. She knew the rules. She knew how to handle passengers. She had always thought of herself as someone who did things by the book. But today she had acted first, thought later. And now she was the one being put in her place. She reached the first-class section just as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. It was a standard announcement, but to Emily it felt like a countdown. 30 minutes until landing. 30 minutes until she would have to face the executives. 30 minutes until she would have to answer for everything she had done. She clenched her hands into fists at her sides before forcing them to relax. Jaden Coleman was already in his seat, settled in as if nothing had happened. He had his seatbelt fastened, his backpack tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of him. He wasn't on his phone anymore. He wasn't looking around, but he was just sitting there, waiting. Emily hesitated. She wasn't used to feeling nervous in front of a passenger. She had always prided herself on being professional, on keeping control. But when Jaden finally glanced up at her, there was something in his eyes that made her feel smaller than she had ever felt before. Not anger, not smugness, just quiet expectation. She cleared her throat, her voice softer than usual. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Jaden tilted his head slightly. "A drink?" Emily nodded quickly, almost relieved. Yes, she could fix this. She could make things right before they landed. "Anything you like. We have fresh juice, sparkling water, tea." Jaden interrupted her, his voice even. "You didn't offer me anything before." Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was such a simple sentence, spoken so casually, but it hit her harder than she had expected. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because he was right. She hadn't greeted him like the other first-class passengers. She hadn't asked if he wanted a drink, if he was comfortable. She hadn't even looked at his ticket. She had just assumed. Jaden watched her for a moment before shrugging. "I'll have a sparkling water." Emily nodded quickly, turning on her heel to rush to the galley. Nicole was already there, her arms crossed. She raised an eyebrow as Emily reached for a glass and the bottle of sparkling water. "That didn't go well, did it?" Emily didn't answer. Nicole didn't need her to. "You embarrass a kid in front of the whole plane, and now it turns out his dad owns the airline," Nicole said, her tone matter of fact. "I'd be sweating too if I were you." Emily gritted her teeth. "Mind your business." Nicole shrugged. "I think it is my business. Because now, when people talk about what happened on this flight, they're going to remember all of us were here. They're going to remember we saw it happen." Emily's fingers tightened around the glass. Nicole took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You know, if you had just treated him like every other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening." Emily exhaled sharply, knowing she was right. She grabbed the glass and hurried back to Jaden's seat, placing it gently on his tray table. "Here you go," she said, keeping her voice even. Jaden picked it up, took a slow sip, then looked up at her again. "By the way," he said, reaching for his phone, "I just texted my dad about you." Emily's stomach twisted. She forced a tight smile. "I see." Jaden set his phone down and took another sip of his drink. His expression was calm. Yeah, he wasn't happy? Emily already knew that. She had heard it in Jordan Coleman's voice over the phone, but hearing the boy say it so casually with quiet confidence made her stomach churn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," Jaden added, flipping another page in the magazine. Emily stiffened. She nodded quickly before turning and walking away. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly in her entire career, but she had a sinking feeling that her problems were only just beginning. As she reached the galley, her hands were shaking. The realization was setting in, fully, completely. This wasn't just about a mistake. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was bigger than her. She had spent years believing she was always in control, that she knew how to handle people, that she was the one setting the rules. But today, she had been forced to see herself the way others saw her. Not as the authority figure, not as the professional, but as the problem. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. Emily Carter had never felt this level of unease in her life. Every flight she had worked in the past 15 years had gone exactly the way she wanted. She set the tone. She enforced the rules. She was the authority in the cabin. But now, for the first time, she wasn't in control, and she knew it. She stood stiffly near the galley, her hands clasped together in front of her, but the usual confidence she carried felt like a distant memory. She could still hear Jaden's words echoing in her mind. "You didn't offer me anything before." She swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling off, but she couldn't. It wasn't just about a drink, it was about everything. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Emily exhaled shakily. She needed to keep moving, needed to focus. Act normal, do your job. But it was almost impossible to ignore the fact that everyone in the first-class cabin had watched everything unfold. She turned toward the front of the cabin, making herself look busy, adjusting a tray, straightening a menu. But she could still feel the weight of the passengers' stares. They had seen her remove Jaden from his seat. They had seen her force him to economy without checking his ticket. And now they had seen her walk him back. It had all played out in front of them like a scene in a movie. But the worst part was the silence. No one had spoken up when she had kicked him out. And now no one was saying anything as they all sat with the heavy discomfort of knowing they had watched a child be humiliated and done nothing. Emily moved stiffly toward Jaden's seat again, hating how different everything felt now. She had walked through this cabin dozens of times before, confident, in control, knowing that passengers would listen when she spoke. But now? Now, as she passed by, people avoided making eye contact with her. She saw it, the guilt, the discomfort. It was in the way the businessman in 2C shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in his watch. It was in the way the woman in 4A tucked her sunglasses higher onto her nose, pretending to scroll through her phone. They didn't want to look at her, because they knew she had been wrong. She stopped beside Jaden's seat, trying to ignore the cold dread swirling in her stomach. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He had barely moved since returning to his seat. His drink sat untouched on his tray table, his fingers resting on the magazine in his lap. Emily cleared her throat. "Is there anything else I can get you before we land?" Jaden blinked at her slowly, tilting his head just slightly. "Now you're asking?" Emily stiffened. His voice wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. But that was what made it worse, because he was just stating the truth. And the truth was, if his father hadn't intervened, she wouldn't have asked him anything at all. Emily forced herself to hold his gaze. "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable," she said carefully. Jaden let out a small, humorless breath. "I was comfortable earlier." He turned back to his magazine, clearly done with the conversation. Emily hesitated, wanting to say something else, wanting to fix something, but there was nothing left to fix. The damage had been done. She nodded stiffly and turned away, walking back toward the galley as quickly as she could. Nicole, standing near the beverage cart, let out a low whistle. That was rough. Emily ignored her, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted this flight to be over. She wanted to get off this plane. She wanted to go back in time and undo all of it, but she couldn't. And she wasn't sure she would ever stop feeling the weight of what she had done. A few minutes later, the pilot's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making our final approach. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all tray tables are in the upright position." Emily exhaled slowly. Almost there. Just a few more minutes. She forced herself to walk through the cabin one last time, double-checking seatbelts, securing loose items. Routine. She needed to focus on routine. But as she passed through first class again, she caught sight of Jaden pulling out his phone, tapping something quickly before setting it back down. Her work tablet vibrated immediately. Emily's stomach dropped. She pulled it out with trembling hands, glancing down at the screen. A forwarded message from the airline's executive office. She swallowed hard and opened it. Take your time. Make her understand what she did. Her breath caught in her throat. That was from Jordan Coleman. He was still watching. She turned, looking back at Jaden's seat, but he wasn't looking at her. He didn't need to, because he already knew exactly what was happening. Emily sat stiffly in her jump seat as the plane began its descent. Her mind was spinning. She was out of time. The moment they landed, she was going to be held accountable. There was no escaping it. The executive board was waiting. Jordan Coleman was waiting. And for the first time in her life, Emily Carter realized she was terrified of what came next. The wheels of the plane touched the ground with a soft jolt, and as the aircraft slowed on the runway, Emily's grip on the armrest tightened. The intercom crackled again. Flight attendants, please prepare for arrival. The passengers began stirring, unbuckling seatbelts, reaching for their belongings. Conversation started up again, but the energy in the cabin was different. Tense. Aware. Emily didn't move. Her work tablet vibrated again. She forced herself to look down. Another message from the executive office. Upon landing, you are to remain on the aircraft. A formal review of your conduct will begin immediately. Do not exit the plane until further instructions are given. Her pulse roared in her ears. She wasn't even going to be allowed to leave. The doors of the plane opened, and one by one, the passengers began filing out. Yes. Emily sat frozen, feeling every step of their departure like a countdown to the inevitable. Finally, the last passenger stepped off. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Then, from the jet bridge, a uniformed security officer stepped inside. His gaze locked onto hers. Miss Carter, come with me. Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. She slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The eyes of the remaining flight attendants burned into her as she followed the officer toward the exit. She had boarded this plane as the most experienced crew member. She was stepping off as someone who might never fly again. And for the first time in her life, she had no one to blame but herself. Emily Carter walked stiffly behind the security officer, her pulse hammering so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear the rustling of passengers gathering their belongings. Each step felt heavier than the last. The terminal was just beyond the jet bridge, but she wasn't walking toward freedom. She was walking toward judgment. She had spent years enforcing order on flights, dictating the rules, ensuring that everything went exactly the way she wanted. And now she was the one being escorted out, not in control, not in charge, just another employee who had made a mistake. A big one that had been caught, one that she couldn't undo. As she passed through the first-class cabin, the weight of every pair of eyes on her pressed against her back. She didn't need to look up to know what they were thinking. She could feel it. She had spent years navigating first class, tending to passengers with perfect practiced professionalism. She knew how to read the energy in a room. And right now it was different. It wasn't just the boy who had put her in this position. It was all of them. Some passengers stared openly. Others quickly averted their eyes, pretending to be focused on their phones or adjusting their watches. Some looked embarrassed, like they had just realized they had been part of something ugly, part of a moment that should have played out differently, but they had done nothing. A businessman in 2C who had watched the entire scene unfold earlier cleared his throat and looked down at his newspaper, flipping a page that he clearly wasn't reading. A woman in 4A, the one who had been sipping champagne and watching the chaos in silent amusement, suddenly wasn't so entertained anymore. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, tugging at the sleeve of her cashmere sweater. Nobody spoke. Nobody offered her a kind word. Nobody said she had been right. That was the part that hit her the hardest, because before she'd been so sure, so certain. She had removed Jaden from his seat, confident that she was maintaining the integrity of first class. She had expected quiet agreement, expected passengers to nod along and think, of course, he doesn't belong here. But now Now she could see the truth in their faces. They hadn't agreed with her. They had just been too cowardly to say anything. And now it was too late. She passed by Jaden's seat, but he didn't look up. He was calm, unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't act like a kid who had just won. Because he hadn't been playing a game. He had just been waiting for justice to catch up. And it had. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. The boy wasn't the one who needed to be nervous about what would happen when they landed. She was. She could hear footsteps behind her. Other flight attendants moving through the cabin, doing their final checks before deplaning. Nicole. Emily knew she was there without having to turn around. She could feel her presence, the younger woman's watchful stare. When she finally risked a glance, Nicole was standing by the galley, arms crossed. She didn't look smug. She didn't look angry. She just looked disappointed, and somehow that was worse. Emily turned her head quickly, unable to stand the silent judgment in the air. She had spent years looking down at people, making snap decisions, enforcing rules the way she saw fit. She had always believed that her authority was absolute. Now she was being escorted off a plane like a problem passenger, and everyone was watching. She stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air hitting her skin like a slap. The security officer walking beside her didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She knew exactly what was waiting for her passengers processing the shift. Meanwhile, back in first class, the passengers were left in the aftermath of what had just happened. Jaden took a slow sip of his drink, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the armrest. He could still feel the weight of the cabin around him, the way the air hadn't quite settled. He wasn't mad. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of thing before, just never this publicly. The difference this time was that the person who had wronged him had been forced to face the consequences. And everyone had seen it happen. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been shifting uncomfortably finally sighed and set down his newspaper. He took off his glasses, rubbing his temples. Well, he muttered, mostly to himself, that was something. The woman in 4A nodded stiffly. She looked at Jaden, opening her mouth as if to say something, but then she closed it, as if realizing there was nothing she could say that would make it better. A younger man in 5B, who had been quietly watching the entire time, shook his head. Should have said something earlier, he muttered under his breath. Jaden didn't react, but he heard it. They were realizing it now. Too late. It was always too late. Nicole moved down the aisle, grabbing an empty glass from the tray table near Jaden's seat. She paused for a second, then looked at him. You okay? Jaden nodded once. Yeah. Nicole hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, You shouldn't have had to deal with that. Jaden didn't respond right away. He glanced out the window at the airport terminal, at the people moving in the distance, unaware of what had just played out on this plane. Then he looked back at Nicole and said, It happens. And that was the part that made her chest tighten. Because he said it like it was normal, like it was just another day. And maybe for him, it was. Nicole exhaled softly and nodded. Well, she said, at least this time someone did something about it. Jaden didn't say anything. He just picked up his phone, typing a quick message. The flight attendants continued their final checks. The passengers grabbed their bags. The world kept moving. But something was different now. Because for once, just once, someone who had done the wrong thing had been forced to deal with it. And everyone had seen it happen. Outside the plane, as Emily stepped out of the jet bridge and into the airport, she felt the shift in the air. The terminal was bustling, filled with people who had no idea what had just unfolded. But for her, everything had changed. Her hands were clammy, her pulse erratic. She wasn't just another flight attendant anymore. She was the one who had made the wrong call. And now, everyone knew it. And worst of all, so did she. Emily Carter had never been afraid of stepping off a plane before. In her 15 years as a flight attendant, she had walked through countless airports, always with a sense of authority, always knowing she belonged. But this time, as she exited the jet bridge, her steps felt heavier than they ever had before. The terminal bustled with life, passengers hurrying to their gates, airport staff moving with practiced efficiency, overhead announcements calling out flight numbers. But none of it registered in Emily's mind. Her world had shrunk down to one singular moment, the moment she had to face the consequences of her actions. A uniformed airline representative was already waiting for her. Not just a supervisor, an executive. That alone told her how bad this was. Routine employee infractions were handled by managers, sometimes by HR. But when an executive was personally waiting for you at the gate, that meant the mistake was big enough to demand top-level intervention. "Miss Carter," the executive greeted her, his expression unreadable. "Come with me." Her stomach twisted. There was no room for argument, no time to plead her case. She nodded stiffly and followed, her feet moving on autopilot, though her mind was screaming at her to run. They walked in silence through a restricted employee corridor, away from the public. Emily could feel the stares of other airline staff as they passed. Gate agents, pilots, baggage handlers. Some of them knew. The news had already started spreading. She could see it in their faces. Some whispered to each other as she walked by. Others just watched. They all knew she had messed up. She had humiliated the son of the most powerful man in the airline business, and now? Now she was being taken somewhere that she might never walk out of as a flight attendant again. Finally, they reached a private conference room, tucked behind security doors. The executive swiped his badge and the door unlocked, with a quiet beep. Emily stepped inside, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering against her ribs. And there they were. The executive board. 4 senior-level executives sat around the polished oak table, their faces grim. At the center of the screen on the far wall, dialed into the meeting remotely from his office, was Jordan Coleman himself. His presence dominated the room. Emily swallowed hard. "Have a seat," the lead executive, a woman with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, said. Emily obeyed, sitting stiffly in the chair across from them. The conference room was cold, sterile, the kind of place where careers were ended with a few well-chosen words. Jordan Coleman leaned forward slightly on the screen. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't showing anger. He didn't have to. His calm, controlled demeanor was infinitely more terrifying. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth. "I assume you know why you're here." Emily's hands clenched together in her lap. "Yes, sir." Jordan studied her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Walk me through your thought process, Onain," he said. "What went through your mind when you decided that my son didn't belong in first class?" Emily's chest tightened, painfully. She opened her mouth, searching for an explanation, but what was she supposed to say? That she had assumed? That she hadn't checked? That she had let an unconscious bias dictate her actions? She had spent years justifying her decisions, making quick calls about passengers, handling conflicts with confidence. But this time, she had no defense. I thought there had been a mistake," she said finally, her voice weak, foreign even to herself. "I didn't verify the system before asking him to move. That was my error." Jordan's eyebrows raised slightly. "Your error?" he repeated. "Tell me, Miss Carter, how often do you ask passengers in first class to prove they belong there?" Emily's heart pounded. I do when necessary." "And how often have you removed a white child from first class under the same suspicion?" The question hit like a slap. Emily's stomach dropped. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Because she knew the answer. She never had. She had walked through first-class hundreds, thousands of times over the years. She had seen children flying alone before. And yet, never once had she questioned a white child's presence in a premium seat. Never once had she assumed they didn't belong. Jordan leaned back in his chair. "That's what I thought." The lead executive cleared her throat, breaking the unbearable silence. Miss Carter, we have reviewed the incident in full. We have flight records, passenger statements, and, of course, firsthand testimony from Mr. Coleman's son. She glanced at the others before continuing. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending a formal review. Emily's lungs felt like they were caving in, suspended. She had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. The executive folded her hands on the table. A decision regarding your employment with the airline will be made in the next 72 hours. Until then, you are prohibited from reporting for duty, accessing company systems, or contacting any crew members regarding this matter. Emily barely heard the rest. She had spent 15 years building her career. She had worked long hours, sacrificed personal time, followed the rules to the letter. And now it all felt like it had been erased in a single day. Jordan Coleman was watching her closely. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't satisfied. He just looked tired, as if this was all too familiar. Finally, he spoke again. You didn't just make a mistake today, Miss Carter. His voice was quiet but sharp as glass. You made a choice. Emily's breath hitched. This is bigger than you, Jordan continued. This is about what your decision meant, what it told my son, what it told everyone who watched it happen. He paused for a moment, then said something that sent a cold shiver down her spine. You took something from my son today. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The words landed like a weight on her chest, because he wasn't just talking about her job. He was talking about who she was, who she had chosen to be in that moment on the plane. She had spent her whole career believing she was always right, always in control. But today, she had been forced to face a truth she had never wanted to acknowledge. And now, she had to decide if she was going to run from it, or own it. The meeting was over. A security officer stepped forward to escort her out. Emily stood slowly, her hands trembling. She had walked onto that plane as the most experienced flight attendant on board. She was walking out as someone who might never work in the industry again. And the worst part, she deserved it. Emily Carter walked out of the conference room, her body moving as if on autopilot. Her hands felt cold, her legs stiff, her breaths shallow. The hallway outside the executive meeting room was silent, sterile, the kind of quiet that made her feel like she was being swallowed whole. She had walked through these employee corridors hundreds of times before. They had always been familiar, comfortable, just another part of her routine. But now? Now they felt foreign, like she didn't belong anymore. The security officer who had been assigned to escort her didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a reminder that she wasn't leaving on her own terms. She was being removed. Emily had watched this happen to others before. Flight attendants who had made critical mistakes, who had crossed a line, who had been called in for urgent meetings and never returned to their posts. She had always told herself that would never be her. Yet here she was. Her mind was still spinning with everything that had just unfolded. The executives, the review, the suspension. But more than anything, Jordan Coleman's words kept repeating in her head like a broken record. You took something from my son today. The question is, what are you going to do about it? That had been the worst part of the entire meeting. Not the suspension, not the impending review. That question. Because for the first time, she had to actually think about what she had done. Not as an employee, not as a flight attendant, as a person. She stepped into the employee corridor leading toward the airline's administrative exit. The glass doors ahead led to a private employee parking lot, a place she had walked through 1,000 times before. But this time, she didn't know if she would ever walk back through these doors again. The moment she stepped through, she felt the shift in energy. Other employees were standing nearby, gate agents, baggage handlers, a few pilots waiting for their next rotation. Some were talking amongst themselves, but their eyes flicked toward her. They knew. Word had already spread. Emily forced herself to keep walking, though every step felt like lead. She could feel the whispers behind her, could feel the weight of silent judgment. She wasn't used to being on this side of it. For years, she had been the one making the calls, the one enforcing the rules, the one who decided who belonged where. But today, she had been the one being judged. And for the first time, she understood what that felt like. At the edge of the parking lot, she stopped. Her car was parked just a few feet away, but she didn't move. Her hands clenched into fists, her breath uneven. She could just leave. She could walk away, drive home, pretend none of this was happening. She could tell herself that it was just a bad day, that it wasn't as bad as they were making it seem. But then she thought about Jaden Coleman. She thought about the look in his eyes when he asked her why. Why did you think I didn't belong here? Emily closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the truth press down on her like an avalanche. Because she had assumed. Because she had looked at him, had a young black boy sitting alone in first class, and had decided without any proof, without checking, that he didn't belong. She had humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of passengers, and now she was being humiliated in return. She let out a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't just about her job anymore. This was about who she was. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her out of her thoughts. She hesitated before pulling it out, a new email, her breath caught from Jaden Coleman. Subject, accountability. Emily's heart pounded as she tapped the screen, her hands shaking slightly. Miss Carter, I'm sure by now you understand the severity of what happened on Flight 297. I won't waste time repeating what has already been made clear by the board. However, I believe in people taking responsibility for their actions, and that includes giving them the opportunity to acknowledge their mistakes. I am giving you that chance now. If you wish to formally apologize to my son, I will make sure he receives your message. However, I want to be clear. This apology isn't for me. It isn't for the airline. It isn't for your career. It's for the person you wronged. If you can't bring yourself to do that, then I see no reason for this conversation to continue. I'll wait for your response. Jaden Coleman. Emily stared at the email, her breath hitched in her throat. She had expected a termination notice. She had expected another warning, another consequence, another reminder of what she had done wrong. But this was something else entirely. A choice. A chance. Not to save her job, not to change what happened, but to own it. Emily inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the phone. She could ignore it. She could pretend she didn't see it. But she knew, deep down she knew, that she had spent her entire career avoiding accountability. She had always been the one in control, the one making the calls, the one who had never been questioned. Now she was the one who had to answer for her actions. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation locking her into place. If she typed this response, there would be no taking it back. She could choose denial. She could frame it as a misunderstanding, blame the system, blame the pressures of her job, or she could tell the truth, her stomach twisted as she began typing. Subject, re-e. Accountability. Mr. Coleman, I don't expect forgiveness and I won't make excuses. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't just misjudge your son. I disrespected him. And worse, I didn't realize it until it was too late. I have spent the last 10 years enforcing rules, thinking I was doing my job the right way. But now I understand that I let my personal bias influence my actions. Whether I intended it or not, that is something I will have to live with. I would like the opportunity to apologize to him directly, but I understand that is entirely his choice. If he doesn't want to hear from me, I accept that. No matter what happens next, I will take full responsibility for my actions. I am sorry. Emily Carter. She hovered over the send button, her pulse pounding. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. The moment the email disappeared from her screen, she let out a shaky breath. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but for the first time, it felt like a step towards something real. She didn't know what would come next. She had no control over what Jaden Coleman would say, over what the board would decide. over whether she would ever work as a flight attendant again. But this she had owned. Emily Carter sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. Passengers wheeled their luggage through the airport. Employees rushed between shifts. Flights took off and landed on schedule. But for her, everything had changed. Her phone lay on the passenger seat, the screen dark, but she couldn't stop staring at it. She had sent the email, the apology. Now all she could do was wait. She had never been in this position before. She had spent her career believing that she was always right, that she was the authority, that her decisions were final. But today had shattered that illusion. She had made a choice, and for the first time, there were consequences she couldn't control. A soft vibration startled her. Her breath hitched as she glanced at the screen. An email from Jordan Coleman. Subject, Accountability. Mr. Coleman, I don't expect forgiveness, and I won't make excuses. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't just misjudge your son. I disrespected him, and worse, I didn't realize it until it was too late. I have spent the last 10 years enforcing rules thinking I was doing my job the right way, but now I understand that I let my personal bias influence my actions. Whether I intended it or not, that is something I will have to live with. I would like the opportunity to apologize to him directly, but I understand that is entirely his choice. If he doesn't want to hear from me, I accept that. No matter what happens next, I will take full responsibility for my actions. I am sorry. Emily Carter. She hovered over the send button, her pulse pounding. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she hit send. The moment the email disappeared from her screen, she let out a shaky breath. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but for the first time, it felt like a step towards something real. She didn't know what would come next. She had no control over what Jordan Coleman would say, over what the board would decide, over whether she would ever work as a flight attendant again. But this she had owned. Emily Carter sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. Passengers wheeled their luggage through the airport. Employees rushed between shifts. Flights took off and landed on schedule. But for her, everything had changed. Her phone lay on the passenger seat, the screen dark, but she couldn't stop staring at it. She had sent the email, the apology. Now all she could do was wait. She had never been in this position before. She had spent her career believing that she was always right, that she was the authority, that her decisions were final. But today had shattered that illusion. She had made a choice, and for the first time, there were consequences she couldn't control. A soft vibration startled her. Her breath hitched as she glanced at the screen. An email from Jordan Coleman. Subject, accountability. Her stomach twisted into knots as she tapped it open. Miss Carter, I appreciate your response. My son will decide whether or not he wants to hear from you directly. That is his choice. Regardless, I wanted you to understand that today was not just about a mistake. It was about how much assumptions cost people. You assumed my son didn't belong. You assumed his presence in first class was an error. And because of that, you humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of passengers who said nothing. You are not the first person to do this to someone. And unless you learn from this, you won't be the last. This isn't just about your career. This is about the kind of person you are when no one is watching. I don't know what the board will decide in your case. That's up to them. But I do know this. If you truly mean what you said in your apology, then you won't just change because you got caught. You'll change because you understand why it matters. I hope for your sake that you do. Jordan Coleman. Emily stared at the screen. Her throat tightened, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the phone back down. She had expected anger. She had expected a definitive answer about her job, her future, but what she got instead was something she hadn't been prepared for. A mirror. Jordan Coleman had forced her to look at herself, to acknowledge something she had never been willing to admit. This wasn't just about one bad decision. This was about who she was, and that was something she couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time in her career, she had been forced to question herself. Would she have treated Jaden differently if he had been white? Would she have made the same assumption? Would she have ignored his ticket, dismissed him, humiliated him in front of an entire cabin? She already knew the answer. That was what made this so hard. She had prided herself on being a professional, a leader, an expert in her field. But today had shown her that none of those things mattered if she couldn't recognize her own blind spots. Her actions had been rooted in something far deeper than just a mistake. They had been rooted in bias, and that realization sat like a weight in her chest, heavy and unshakable. She could hear Nicole's voice in her head, clear as day. If you had just treated him like every other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening. It was such a simple truth, and yet, it had taken an entire career-ending event for her to see it. A quiet sigh left her lips as she leaned back against the headrest, closing her eyes. She didn't know what would happen next. Maybe the executive board would fire her. Maybe they would let her come back after a suspension. Maybe she would never work in this industry again. But that wasn't what mattered right now. Right now, she had to face the bigger question: who was she going to be when no one was watching? For years, she had enforced the rules, believing she was doing the right thing. But now she understood something she had never considered before. The rules weren't always just. The way she had treated Jaden had been wrong, and no corporate policy, no flight protocol, no excuse could change that. So, what was she going to do about it? She exhaled slowly, reaching for her phone again. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at emails from the airline. She wasn't checking flight schedules or reviewing procedures. She was looking for something different. Resources, books, training programs, organizations that focused on bias awareness, diversity, and accountability in customer service. If she was going to change, she had to start somewhere. She wasn't naive enough to think that an apology was enough. She wasn't naive enough to believe that learning about bias would erase what she had done. But if she truly meant what she said in her email, if she truly understood why this mattered, then she had to do the work. Not for her career, not for the airline, for herself. Her fingers hovered over the search bar before she finally typed, "How to recognize and correct unconscious bias in the workplace." She hit enter. It was a small step, but it was the first one. She wasn't sure if it would be enough to fix everything. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about fixing her career. She was thinking about fixing herself. The airport outside her car was still busy, people moving in and out, flights arriving and departing. But for Emily Carter, everything had slowed down. She sat there for a long moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. Then, with a deep breath, she turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot. She didn't know where she was going next, but for the first time in her life, she was finally willing to learn.